He was alone, trapped beneath the earth in a black-walled cave where sound died, light vanished, and hope was supposed to disappear with it. His rifle was gone, his ammunition spent, his escape cut off by collapsing stone and enemy soldiers who believed they had cornered a doomed man. 50 Japanese troops surrounded the only exit, confident he would suffocate in the darkness or crawl out begging for mercy. But they didn't understand who they were hunting. For the next several hours, inside tunnels so tight a man could barely breathe, Sergeant Daniel Hayes fought a silent war no history book could fully capture. Armed with nothing but a single combat knife and the will to survive, he turned that cave into one of the most terrifying battlegrounds of World War II. Soldiers entered the darkness by the dozens, and none of them came back out. This is not a myth, not a legend, not a tale polished by time. This is the true story of a man who faced 50 enemies with nothing but steel in his hand and fire in his heart, and walked out of that cave alive. Before Daniel Hayes ever set foot inside that cave, nothing about his mission suggested he was about to enter one of the most desperate fights of the Pacific War. On paper, it was routine. Dangerous, yes, but ordinary for a reconnaissance specialist trained to slip behind Japanese lines and vanish into the jungle as if he were made of smoke. Hayes had survived malaria, ambushes, starvation, and monsoon storms that cracked trees like matchsticks. He was the man commanders trusted when they couldn't afford failure. On January 14, 1944, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Allied forces were preparing a large offensive aimed at breaking a fortified Japanese defensive belt that had stopped 3 previous assaults cold. Every attack had been met with brutal resistance. Machine gun nests hidden in roots, snipers perched in the canopy, mines buried beneath leaves. The Japanese always seemed to know exactly where the Americans were coming from, exactly when they would strike. Someone needed to figure out why. Intelligence believed the answer lay in a supply corridor carved through the mountains, a hidden artery used to move ammunition, rations, and reinforcements. If the Allies could confirm its route, they could strike it, choke off supplies, and force Japanese commanders to abandon their positions. If not, the coming offensive would drown in blood. Hayes and his 3-man patrol moved out before dawn, silhouettes swallowed by the jungle's green-black shadow. The canopy above was so thick that sunrise barely reached the forest floor. They waded through knee-deep mud, cut through vines that clung to their uniforms like claws, and advanced in absolute silence. Every breath had weight. Every snapped twig could give away their position. 6 hours into the mission, Hayes found signs confirming their worst fears. Fresh boot prints, ration tins, and cartridge belts, all Japanese. The supply route was far more active than intelligence had predicted. Dozens of soldiers had passed through recently, maybe hundreds. Hayes studied the terrain, sketched notes on his map, and prepared to lead his men back. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable metallic click of a rifle safety being switched off. Not one, not two, many. The ambush was instant. Gunfire erupted from the trees like a storm of steel. The first volley cut down 2 men before they could return fire. The 3rd man, bleeding from a shoulder wound, staggered behind a fallen log. Hayes shouted for him to retreat and covered him with bursts from his M1 rifle. The jungle exploded with sound, shouting, the crack of rifles, the bark of machine gun rounds chopping through branches. Hayes fought until his rifle ran dry. Then he dropped it and threw 2 grenades to break contact. But the Japanese were already circling, tightening a trap that would snap shut in minutes. With no ammunition left and no possibility of reaching friendly lines, Hayes was forced into a single choice: disappear into the mountains or die on that trail. He ran, not out of fear but calculation. Terrain was his only weapon now. He sprinted up a slope choked with roots, leapt over a stream, and pushed deeper into terrain thick enough to slow even the most disciplined patrols. Behind him, he heard shouting, whistles, the coordinated calls of soldiers tracking a wounded animal. Hayes wasn't wounded, but he was cornered.
As he climbed a ridge covered in moss, his foot slid on wet stone. The ground beneath him gave way. He crashed through a curtain of vines and fell. The world spun. Darkness swallowed everything. He tumbled down a steep rock chute and slammed onto cold stone. When he opened his eyes, he realized where he was. A cave. Silent, lightless, deep. And the only way back to the surface was now crawling with enemy soldiers. Hayes listened as boots pounded the ground above. They knew he had fallen somewhere nearby. They were spreading out, forming a perimeter. He checked his gear. No rifle, no sidearm, no ammunition. Just a torn map, a battered canteen, and the combat knife strapped to his boot. That knife would decide whether he lived or died.
When Hayes finally pushed himself up from the cave floor, the first thing he noticed was silence. A thick, heavy silence that felt alive, as if the darkness itself were listening. He blinked, but nothing changed. The cave swallowed every trace of daylight. Only a faint smear of gray far behind him marked the hole he'd fallen through. Above it, he could hear distant voices echoing through the jungle canopy. Japanese troops were spreading out, triangulating his last known position. He wasn't hidden, he was trapped. Hayes crouched near the faint shaft of light and tried to steady his breathing. The fall had knocked the wind from his chest, scraped his arms, bruised his ribs. But he could move. That meant he could fight. He checked his equipment again, hoping the darkness would reveal something he'd missed. It didn't. His rifle was gone. His sidearm was gone. His ammunition belt was torn open during the fall, magazines scattered somewhere on the ridge above. All he had was his knife, 7 inches of steel, sharpened the night before the mission, out of habit, not prophecy. Outside, the Japanese voices grew clearer. They were organizing, calling out distances, assigning sectors. He heard the words repeated over and over, a phrase he understood without translation. Find him. Hayes backed deeper into the cave, allowing his eyes to adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged. Jagged stone, uneven floors, tight passages that twisted like the veins of a mountain. This wasn't a single chamber, it was a network. Narrow tunnels branched away in several directions, some angled downward into blackness, others bent sideways, disappearing around sharp turns where the darkness thickened into something almost physical. He tested one tunnel, scraping his shoulder against rock barely wide enough for him to pass. Another tunnel was taller, but sloped downward at a steep angle. Moisture dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, each drop echoing like distant footsteps. This was no simple hiding place. It was a labyrinth carved by centuries of water and pressure, a maze where even experienced explorers could lose themselves forever. He needed to understand the terrain before the Japanese found the entrance. Hayes moved cautiously along the walls, one hand outstretched, feeling for sudden drops. The cave breathed with cold drafts that slipped across his skin. He heard faint noises, the distant rumble of shifting stone, the scurry of bats deeper inside, the whisper of wind squeezing through cracks he couldn't see. The cave was alive in a way the jungle was not. The jungle had predators he understood. The cave had secrets he didn't. Then came the sound he dreaded most, boots. Japanese soldiers were at the entrance now. He heard them calling into the cave, their voices bouncing against the walls, multiplying through echoes until he couldn't tell how many men there were. The lanterns they carried cast flickering yellow light that crawled across a rock. Shadows stretched like claws. Hayes pressed himself against a cold stone and watched as the first silhouette appeared at the cave's lip. A rifle barrel glinted. Another soldier stepped beside him, then another. They weren't guessing anymore. They were preparing to enter. Hayes retreated deeper, step by slow step, careful not to kick loose rocks that would give away his position. His heartbeat thudded loud enough he feared they could hear it. He forced himself to breathe silently through his nose, slow and controlled. He had been in firefights before, had survived ambushes and close calls, but this wasn't a firefight, this was a hunt. And for the first time since he landed in the Pacific, he wasn't the one stalking the enemy, he was the prey. The Japanese lit more lanterns and eased forward. Hayes saw their silhouettes multiply, merging and splitting in the shifting glow. They were mapping the cavern visually, noting shadows, examining the walls for escape routes. One soldier knelt to inspect the floor, brushing away dirt with the back of his hand. Hayes recognized the gesture, tracking. They were skilled, disciplined, trained for this terrain. He backed deeper until he felt a bend in the tunnel. Once he rounded it, he was swallowed in absolute black. If he reached out, he couldn't see his own hand. His breath fogged the air and drifted upward, vanishing into a ceiling he couldn't measure. Behind him, the lantern light grew brighter as soldiers advanced in measured formation. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They believed they had a cornered enemy with nowhere to run. They thought the darkness was on their side. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the deeper Hayes moved, the more the cave turned riflemen into liabilities. Rifles were long, heavy, and useless in tight spaces. Noise was amplified, vision was restricted, and every step they took toward him multiplied the advantage of the one thing Hayes still had: silence. Minutes passed. Then voices barked outside the entrance, orders to bring more men, to seal the perimeter, to prepare for a sweep. Hayes heard the scrape of stones being piled near the entrance. The Japanese weren't just entering the cave, they were reinforcing it, preparing to occupy it, unaware an American soldier was already buried in its spine. That was when Hayes realized the truth. He wasn't simply trapped underground. He was trapped underground with an entire Japanese unit marching toward him, and the only way out was through them.
Hayes pressed himself deeper into the cave's twisting throat as the first Japanese soldiers stepped beyond the entrance. Their lanterns threw shaky spheres of light across the stone, illuminating ridges and shadows that twisted in every direction. The cave distorted sound so violently that every footstep seemed both inches away and 100 yards distant. Hayes didn't know how many were entering. 5, 10, more? It didn't matter. Any number was too many for a man with nothing but a knife. He tightened his grip on the hilt, letting the familiar weight settle into his palm. It wasn't a weapon designed for heroics. It was for cutting rope, opening crates, scraping mud from boots. But in tight spaces like these, steel didn't need to be fancy. It needed to be fast. The first lantern-bearing soldier advanced cautiously, sweeping the beam left and right. He muttered something about the tracks at the entrance, about seeing blood on a rock where Hayes had landed. The second soldier replied that the American must be wounded. They were confident, careless. They believed they were hunting a man who could barely walk. Hayes listened to every word, every breath. He waited until they were close enough that he could smell the oil burning in their lanterns. 2 more soldiers entered, then another, a small squad, not enough to overwhelm him at once, but more than enough to trap him deeper inside the twisting tunnels. Hayes knew if they pushed further, if they reached the first tight turn, only one man could pass at a time. That was his chance. A narrow space, close quarters, no rifles could be brought to bear. He retreated a few steps into the black curve of the passage and flattened himself along the wall, body still, breath shallow. He could hear their boots now, the soft crunch of grit under soles, the quiet metallic clicks of safety latches being checked. They were preparing to move as a unit. One man extended his rifle ahead of him as a probe. Another raised a lantern, casting elongated shadows across the cavern walls. Then one soldier did what Hayes expected someone eventually would. He stepped too far ahead of the others. Curiosity kills faster than bullets in places like this. The soldier leaned into the tunnel, lantern extended, trying to peer into the darkness. His face illuminated in a soft glow, squinting as he strained to see deeper. Hayes watched silently, counting the seconds as the man advanced another step, another half-step. That was enough. In a single movement honed by training and instinct, Hayes closed the distance. His left hand clamped over the soldier's mouth, dragging him into the darkness as the knife pierced upward beneath the ribcage. The soldier shuddered once and went limp. Hayes lowered him gently, preventing the clatter of falling gear from alerting the others. But silence doesn't stay secret long in a cave. The lantern the soldier carried slipped from his weakening fingers and rolled against the stone, its flame flickering wildly.
The others saw the sudden movement and froze. They called out to him once, then again. No answer. One man stepped forward. Another asked if he had slipped. Hayes pulled the body deeper, vanishing around the bend. Moments later, a second soldier entered the passage, stopping just short of the curve. He gripped his rifle tightly, lantern held high. His breathing grew faster as he called the missing man's name. He took another step, another. Hayes struck again. This time the soldier tried to shout, but Hayes's arm locked around his throat, cutting off the sound. The knife flashed once. His legs buckled. His lantern slipped from his grasp and shattered, plunging the tunnel into total darkness. The men outside reacted instantly, rifles lifted, voices fired commands back and forth. They knew something was wrong now, 2 soldiers disappearing without a shot. They fanned out, checking the walls, searching the floor for footprints, but the cave played tricks on their senses. Shadows consumed their lantern light, echoes misdirected their movements, footsteps rebounded off stone, making it impossible to know where Hayes truly was. One officer barked an order. They would sweep the tunnel. Hayes heard them forming up, 3 in front, 2 behind, lanterns held high, rifles tucked close to their chests. They had abandoned caution. They were coming in force. They believed overwhelming numbers would flush out the lone American. What they didn't understand was that the cave itself was his ally. Beyond the curve, the passage narrowed to a width barely wider than a man's shoulders. In that space, rifles became burdens. Platoon tactics dissolved. The first man in line became a choke point, and behind him, the others would be blind, deaf, and unable to maneuver. Hayes positioned himself just beyond the tightest squeeze, heart steady, breath controlled. The first Japanese soldier forced his way around the turn. He never finished the motion. Hayes's knife slashed across his throat, and the soldier collapsed in the shrinking cone of lantern light. The second soldier stepped forward, tripping over his comrade's body. Before he could react, Hayes used the narrow walls to push off and drive the blade into his neck. The third soldier panicked, fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flash illuminating terror on his face, but in a space barely wider than his body, the recoil slammed his rifle against the stone, the shot ricocheting harmlessly. Hayes closed in. A struggle erupted, bodies colliding against stone, boots scraping, fists striking in darkness punctuated by the occasional flash of steel. The soldier screamed for help, but the tight passage strangled the sound, reducing it to a warped echo that his comrades couldn't trace. Moments later, he went silent. The remaining soldiers outside hesitated. They had expected a cornered animal. Instead, they had walked into the jaws of something far more dangerous, a silent predator who turned the mountain's veins into killing grounds. They regrouped, terrified whispers bouncing across the walls. They didn't know where Hayes had moved. They didn't know how many soldiers he had already killed. Some believed they were facing a squad. Others thought a machine gun nest was hidden deeper inside. Nobody imagined the truth. One man with a knife. In darkness, where numbers meant nothing.
Night fell outside the cave, but inside, darkness had ruled from the moment Hayes crashed through the ridge. Time became disjointed, measured not by minutes or hours, but by breaths, heartbeats, and the rhythm of boots entering the tunnels. Hayes didn't know how long he had been fighting. Sweat mixed with the grit on his skin. His hands were raw from gripping the knife, his knuckles bruised from striking stone and bone. But the adrenaline that carried him through each encounter never faded. It sharpened. The Japanese, frustrated and frightened, changed tactics. No more small squads, no more cautious sweeps. They brought numbers now, overwhelming numbers. Hayes heard officers outside giving orders in hurried, clipped tones. Reinforcements were arriving. Lanterns flickered at the entrance as more soldiers crowded forward, their shadows pooling like ink along the walls. The cave mouth glowed with a halo of firelight born from dozens of lamps. At least 50 men, possibly more. They believed they could drown the darkness with bodies. Hayes listened as they arranged themselves into staggered formations. The cave was no longer a hunting ground. It was becoming a battlefield. But it remained a battlefield on his terms. The first wave entered loudly, intentionally. Boots stomped, rifle bolts snapped, blades scraped from scabbards. It was psychological warfare. They wanted the American to hear them coming, wanted him to feel surrounded, cornered, hopeless. Hayes felt none of that. Instead, he heard something else in their footsteps: fear. Their rhythm was uneven, their breathing too fast. No soldier wanted to be first in line. Hayes moved deeper into a chamber he had found earlier, a hollow space where the ceiling dipped low and rock columns divided the chamber like natural barricades. It funneled movement into single file. If he fought there, only one man could reach him at a time. He positioned himself behind a column, blade pressed tight against his forearm, listening. The Japanese were fanning out, probing side passages, shouting into the dark for any sign of movement. Then a command rang out, echoed by dozens of boots shifting direction. They were coming straight for him. The first group arrived at the chamber entrance, 6 soldiers with bayonets fixed, lanterns raised high. Behind them more shadows shifted. Hayes didn't need to see them clearly. He could hear the creak of leather straps, the jingle of canteen clips, the rapid breaths of men bracing themselves to enter a place they believed was haunted with death. The lead man stepped past the threshold. Hayes exploded behind the column. His knife slashed across the lantern, extinguishing the flame in an instant. Darkness slammed into the room like a physical force. Men shouted in shock. A second later, the blade found a throat, a choked gasp, a body collapsing. Before the others could react, Hayes was gone again, slipping behind another pillar as confusion devolved into chaos. The soldiers lit another lantern, only to have it shattered by Hayes's knife thrown from the shadows. The crash of glass, the sputter of flame, the panic rising like boiling water. He didn't give them time to recover. He struck again, this time from the opposite side of the chamber. One soldier fell with a gurgled cry, another tripped over his body, slamming into a stone pillar. The cramped space amplified every sound: armor clattering, weapons scraping, men shouting the names of comrades who didn't answer. More soldiers pushed into the chamber now, driven by orders and terror. They fired blindly into the dark, muzzle flashes lighting the cavern for fractions of a second, just long enough to reveal Hayes's silhouette darting past a pillar, fragmenting like a ghost in the flame. He closed in. The next few minutes were a brutal orchestra of quiet violence, blows landing, bodies falling, steel slicing through the dense, humid air. Hayes used every advantage the cave offered: darkness, echo, tight turns, and the panic of men who no longer trusted their own senses. They fired at shadows, stabbed at air, collided with one another in their desperation to regain control. But control was gone. The cave belonged to Hayes now. As more soldiers surged in, their numbers worked against them. They blocked each other's movements, creating choke points where their long rifles snagged on rock, where they couldn't raise bayonets high enough to strike, where the fear of hitting their own comrades paralyzed them. Hayes struck like a force of nature, fast, silent, relentless. A soldier screamed that they needed to retreat. Another shouted that there were multiple Americans. A third insisted the cave was cursed. The commanding officer tried to restore order, but his words dissolved under the weight of terror. The mountain swallowed discipline whole. Hayes seized that moment. He broke through their line, carving a path along the chamber wall, vanishing into darkness. The soldiers panicked, firing wildly. Bullets ricocheted, whining off stone like angry hornets. Lanterns shattered, men tripped. Someone saw eyes in the dark. But Hayes had moved behind them. One by one, he took them down. A slash to the hamstring to collapse a soldier silently, a quick thrust beneath the ribs, a hand over a mouth, dragging a man backward into blackness. The cave floor grew slick beneath their boots, and fear turned into something primal. When the surviving soldiers finally stumbled back toward the entrance, gasping for breath, lanterns flickering in shaking hands, they were unable to understand what had happened. They had sent wave after wave into the cave, dozens of trained fighters, and the darkness had consumed them. They whispered to their officers that an entire American squad was entrenched inside. Others insisted demons were living in the rock. None dared re-enter. By the time the officers forced them forward again, half of their original number was gone. By dawn, nearly 50 soldiers had entered the cave. Not one came out. And inside that mountain of stone, Daniel Hayes stood alone, chest heaving, knife dripping, surrounded by silence once more. Not the silence of fear, the silence of victory, brutal, impossible, and earned in the darkest battlefield of the war, the space between heartbeats where only survival exists.
Not because he was afraid. Fear had burned itself out in the hours of slaughter that came before, but because his body trembled from exhaustion, dehydration, and the cold realization that he had survived something no man was meant to endure. The cave was quiet again. No voices, no boots, no lanterns. Only the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the faint echo of wind seeping through cracks somewhere far above. But victory in the darkness meant nothing if he died inside it. Hayes steadied his trembling hands against the stone wall, feeling the cold bite through his skin. He exhaled slowly, a long, steady breath that became mist in the frigid air. He knew dawn had broken outside. He could sense it in the subtle shift of temperature, the faint glow creeping through the tunnels like the breath of a waking world. That same light revealed something else he hadn't noticed in the fog of combat: smoke. Thin at first, barely visible, but it grew thicker with each breath. Hayes froze. Smoke meant only one thing: the Japanese hadn't given up. They were changing tactics again. They were going to burn him out. He heard voices outside the cave, harsher now, desperate. Men barked orders, brush and branches scraped against rock, the crackle of kindling caught flame. Soon thick plumes of smoke rolled through the entrance. The Japanese weren't risking any more close combat. They would suffocate the enemy they could not kill. Hayes crouched low as the first wave of smoke hit him. It clawed at his eyes, stung his lungs, clung to the walls like poison fog. He fought the urge to cough. Every sound could betray him. He forced his breath slow, shallow, controlled. He needed to think. He needed an exit they hadn't sealed. The deeper tunnels angled downward into choking blackness. If he went that way, he'd die in the dark, lost in a maze with no air. The only viable escape was the entrance, the same entrance the Japanese were guarding, the same ground littered with bodies that would soon show them exactly how many men they had lost. Smoke thickened. The cave walls shimmered in the growing haze. Hayes blinked tears from his eyes and crawled toward the source of fresh air, the entrance he could no longer see but could feel, faint as a heartbeat. He moved through the tunnels like an animal, low to the ground, one hand skimming stone to guide him. Smoke grew hotter, thicker, ached in his chest like a constricting fist. He reached a corner and stopped. Voices were close now. Maybe 5 soldiers, maybe more. They were coughing from their own fire. The smoke wasn't their ally, not completely. It disoriented them, too. Lanterns flickered, dim and unreliable in the swirling gray. Hayes wiped the sweat and soot from his face, leaving streaks of black across his skin. The knife in his hand glinted in the dying firelight. He wasn't going to survive a prolonged fight, not anymore. His muscles screamed with every movement. His arms trembled from fatigue, but he still had one last weapon: momentum. He waited until the wind shifted, pushing a thick, suffocating wave of smoke outward through the cave mouth. That was his moment. Hayes broke into a sprint. He burst through the smoke like a specter, coughing, eyes narrowed to slits. The first Japanese soldier didn't even have time to shout. Hayes slammed into him, knocking him aside, grabbing the man's rifle mid-fall. Another soldier reached for his weapon, but the smoke blinded him, and Hayes struck him with the rifle butt before he could fire. Then he ran. He didn't look back. He didn't check how many men were chasing him. He didn't listen for shouts or gunfire. He tore into the jungle at full speed, lungs burning, vision blurring, each step fueled by the final reserves of a body held together only by will.
Bullets cracked through the branches behind him, snapping leaves, carving splinters from trees. Hayes zigzagged through dense underbrush, trusting muscle memory, letting instinct guide him. His legs threatened to collapse with every stride. His chest tightened, his throat burned. Still, he ran. After what felt like miles, though it was barely a few hundred yards, the sound of gunfire faded, the shouting grew distant. The jungle swallowed him the same way the cave had, but this time it protected him. Hayes dropped behind a fallen tree, gasping for air. Smoke rose from the direction of the cave, billowing above the canopy like a dark signal to whatever gods governed the mountain. He lay still, heart hammering, waiting for pursuit. None came. The Japanese were too afraid of the cave now. They believed it cursed, and in a way it was. Not by spirits or demons, but by a single man who had turned its depths into a graveyard. For 3 days, Hayes wandered the jungle driven by instinct alone. He drank from rivers, ate what he could find, slept in short, brutal bursts interrupted by nightmares of lantern light and echoing footsteps. His uniform was shredded, his skin was torn, fever crept into his veins. But on the morning of the 3rd day, he stumbled into a forward Allied post. The men who found him didn't recognize him at first. He was covered in soot and blood, eyes sunken, knife still clutched in a trembling hand. He tried to speak, but the words dissolved into a hoarse whisper. When they finally understood who he was and that he had survived, silence fell across the camp. Because what Hayes did inside that cave wasn't just survival. It was something beyond human endurance, something that defied every rule of war. And no one, not even Hayes himself, could fully explain how he made it out alive.
For the rest of his life, Daniel Hayes rarely spoke of what happened inside that cave. When questioned by intelligence, he gave a stripped-down, clinical version, engaged enemy forces at close quarters, evaded capture, rejoined friendly lines. Nothing more. No number, no details. No mention of the bodies in the dark, the narrow corridors, the smoke, the shadows that clung to him long after sunrise. But the men who served with him knew something extraordinary had happened. They saw the look in his eyes when he returned, not the 1,000-yard stare of a man broken by war, but something deeper, something forged under pressure so immense it left marks no medical report could document. He had walked through a night no human being should have survived, and somehow emerged with a heartbeat and a story he refused to claim as heroism.